seemed to believe that he could be a family man and supply this booze and kill people when he had to, and still somehow come out of it all. Maybe it was naive, but the guy really seemed to think that he could pull it off.
On the morning of February 14th, 1929, Valentine's Day, Al Capone was vacationing at the new villa he had bought on Palm Island off Miami Beach, Florida. Back in Chicago, the truce Capone had tried to impose on the city's bootlegging gangs had collapsed again. His chief rival was George Bugs Moran, the triggerman who had once almost killed Capone's mentor, Johnny Torrio, and had made a failed attempt on Capone's life as well. Moran loathed Capone and loved saying so to newspapermen. Capone was a beast and a behemoth, he said, lower than a snake's belly, because he dealt in flesh, prostitution, as well as beer. In Chicago that morning, according to one of many contradictory stories, Moran received a phone call. It was from a nameless hijacker who said he had a big stolen shipment of whiskey for sale. Moran told his caller to drive it to a garage at 2122 North Clark Street. He'd meet him there at 10:30. At the appointed time, 7 of Moran's men were waiting inside the garage for the hijacker to arrive. Moran himself was late. He had stopped for a haircut. Meanwhile, 4 men drove up in a Cadillac and hurried into the garage. 2 wore police uniforms. They all carried shotguns or submachine guns. They lined Moran's men up against the wall. Then they opened fire.
They're nice and bloody, a lot of photography, no investigation required. And who do you lay it on? Well, our favorite guy, Capone. Capone did this, in spite of the fact that he was in Florida.
It was extremely cold-blooded. Nobody knows to this day who did it. Nobody was ever arrested. Nobody was ever charged with the crime. It was widely believed to have been the work of Al Capone, who was said to be in pursuit of Bugs Moran. Bugs Moran was not one of the 7 men killed.
No one could ever prove Capone was involved. The killers got away clean. Bugs Moran managed to hold on to his territory and what was left of his gang, but continued to feud bitterly with Capone. The Chicago American reported that Chicago gangsters graduated yesterday from murder to massacre. Something had to be done.
The Valentine's Day Massacre becomes a rallying point at which people say enough is enough. Something's got to be done about this. There have been other shootings where, half a dozen people had been killed before, but this one is different. It seemed ridiculous to people that after all these years, nobody had done anything about it, that these gangsters can continue to operate with impunity. That Al Capone, sitting in his mansion in Florida on the beach with a cigar in his mouth and a fishing rod poked into the water, can order a hit and have 7 men taken out in Chicago, and nobody would do anything about it, that he wasn't even arrested.
Gang violence was on the rise in nearly every American city.
Spraying this crowded street with lead at Dyckman Street and Broadway, 2 thugs who killed 2 policemen in cold blood met death in this bullet-riddled cab. The cab itself was hit 42 times in the running gunfight. Look at those bullet holes. The crowd, which a few minutes before fled in panic from the bandits' fire, pressed the police hard in an attempt to see the dead bandit taken away. He goes to join his 2 companions, who died on the way to the hospital.
Slaughter was bad for business. Even the mobsters began to worry that things were getting out of hand. 2 of the shrewdest now lived in New York City: Capone's old employer, Johnny Torrio, and Meyer Lansky, who had already joined forces to organize the bootlegging and rum-running businesses from Boston to the Great Lakes. For 3 days in May of 1929, an unprecedented conclave of mob bosses from the eastern half of the country strolled together along the beach at Atlantic City, New Jersey. Johnny Torrio and Meyer Lansky were there. So were Charles King Solomon from Boston, Boo Boo Hoff from Philadelphia, Kansas City's Johnny Lazia, Lucky Luciano, Frank Costello, Dutch Schultz, and Albert Anastasia from New York. Together, they agreed to build a national crime syndicate.
They had finally a sit-down and said, we can't kill each other. And they divided up territories nationally using the Federal Reserve Bank's grid to figure out where the zones were.
Prohibition had been intended in part to reduce crime. Instead, it had provided small-time criminals with a world of opportunities to increase exponentially their profits and their power.
They learned during Prohibition how to do the things that they would need to do in the years ahead in every form of organized crime that we've seen since. How to control money, how to control troops, how to divide territory with each other, how to cooperate, how to end feuds. Prohibition was the finishing school, the college and the graduate school for the criminal syndicates of America.
Al Capone had attended the Atlantic City summit too. It had been called in part because of the St. Valentine's Day massacre, which had brought so much unwanted attention. Afterwards, he told a reporter, "At Atlantic City, we all agreed to bury the past and forget warfare in the future, for the general good of all concerned." In Chicago, the general good usually meant what was good for Capone. His business was booming. Illegal beer was as plentiful as ever. No one, it seemed, could touch him. Each morning that spring, President Hoover and some of his officials exercised together on the White House lawn. The press called the group the Medicine Ball Cabinet. One day, as Hoover hurled the ball, he asked the Secretary of the Treasury, Andrew Mellon, "Have you got this fellow Capone yet? Remember now, I want that man Capone in jail."
After a couple of dreary weeks in which the nightclubs of the town were half full of ruined stock market victims, trying to get cheered up and inevitably ending the evening with a crying jag on the head waiter's shoulder, things seem almost normal again. Though I suppose every time the market slips a point, the wailing will start up once more.